Welcome to this 3-month retrospective on me using Ubuntu Cinnamon 2304, which happens to be the first release of this operating system that became an official flavor of Ubuntu. And like I said, I've been using it definitely over 3 months, fairly close to about 3.5 months at this point. And so I think this is probably a pretty good time to give you my thoughts on how the operating system is and performs and how I've liked it so far or haven't liked it in certain aspects. So let me go ahead and just start breaking down a lot of the pros and cons and just kind of the feel for the operating system itself. So one of the reasons why I felt like giving this OS a try in the first place is because I decided to recently upgrade my computer, and I upgraded to one of the newer Ryzen models. In fact, let me go ahead and just bring up my NeoFetch settings here. So I upgraded to a Ryzen 7 7700 that you can see here in the output. And basically, I've upgraded almost everything with my computer with one exception, and that being the video card. And I'll get to the video card in a moment because I think there's a lot of stuff that is still very much relevant for a lot of users that still are sticking to using Nvidia video cards that I definitely want to point out with this distribution. And but anyway, as far as the CPU and everything, because it is a newer CPU and I have newer components and whatnot on the motherboard, one of the reasons why I decided to get away from using Mint is because I wanted to have the newer kernel and access to the features and built-in improvements that kernel had available. And as you can see, the kernel on this version currently is 6.2.0-26, which is, the 6.2 probably was pretty close to almost the most recent when this came out in April. So there have been obviously new kernel releases since then, but with the Ubuntu release model of every 6 months, basically the only thing you're going to really get are security updates on the kernel. So that's kind of the brief synopsis as to why I decided to give Ubuntu Cinnamon a try, because the kernel on Linux Mint, in comparison, I believe that the best one you can get is 5.19, and I just wanted to make sure I had the more recent kernel basically to support my hardware. Having said that, I was a big fan of the Cinnamon desktop environment, and I just like using Cinnamon. So I decided to give Ubuntu Cinnamon a try rather than try to jump ship to something that'd be more Arch based or Fedora or something like that. That would basically be a non-Ubuntu based distribution. So if you like the Cinnamon desktop environment, Ubuntu Cinnamon may be the best option that you may want to consider if you want to get with something other than Linux Mint. Now, one thing I will say though, there are some pretty substantial differences between Ubuntu Cinnamon and Linux Mint. And the whole time I've been using Ubuntu Cinnamon, to be honest with you, it feels more like Pop! OS or Zorin OS in that a lot of the underlying systems are basically GNOME applications, as it were. And a good example of that would be the file manager. So this file manager is something I feel that is not the same file manager that I was using in Linux Mint, but I've seen this one before on Pop! OS and Zorin OS, and so there's a lot of aspects to this operating system. It's like, okay, we're going to take Ubuntu and we're going to remove the overall GNOME desktop environment, put Cinnamon on top of it, but the underlying core is still Ubuntu. So that's something to keep in mind. Like, okay, so this isn't just basically Linux Mint with the latest kernel. It's not that. It is definitely more of a hodgepodge put together ideas of Ubuntu, standard Ubuntu with GNOME desktop environment, and Linux Mint with the desktop environment. So it's definitely a bit of a hodgepodge, and like I said, it feels a little more like Pop! OS and Zorin OS in that regards. At least to me, that's how it felt like. So, having said that, I will say that one thing this operating system did that was actually very surprising to me is theming seemed to be a lot more consistent, believe it or not, on this version of Cinnamon. And let me go ahead and bring this back up real quick. So you see we have Cinnamon 5.6.7, which was the latest at the time of Ubuntu Cinnamon's release. Now keep in mind that that's not the latest version of the Cinnamon desktop environment, because if you want to have, you have to kind of weigh the two options really. With Linux Mint, you will get the latest version of the Cinnamon desktop environment. With Ubuntu Cinnamon, you will have probably access to newer kernels more frequently than you will on Linux Mint. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. What do you want? Do you need the kernel access, or do you want the most up-to-date desktop environment? So again, it's not a very easy decision to say, oh, I'm just going to jump over to Ubuntu Cinnamon because it's basically an updated version of Linux Mint, because it's not the case. But going back to what I was saying before, theming is actually surprisingly very good and a little more consistent, believe it or not, in Linux Mint. One of the things that I had prior to using this distribution is, I believe, now the icons have always been okay. I use Yaru Red Dark. They had a slightly different theme in Linux Mint, but for the most part, still basically what I prefer is a dark red theme. As you see here, they have the Cinnamon Dark, but you can also just get the standard light theme there. Or you can even go the Linux Mint default Cinnamon theme. But not a lot of options in the mouse pointers, excuse me. There's only the one mouse pointer option. By default, I didn't download anything, but you can actually, just like on normal Cinnamon, come here and download extra themes. I didn't do that, and basically I kind of want to show the default themes anyway, so just so you can compare. But the main difference here is the applications section. Basically, you have a light theme and a dark theme, and when I was using Linux Mint, one of the things I went with I think I had to use a light theme with some other sort of additions. And one of the reasons why I had to do that was because I couldn't read any of my documents in LibreOffice. Sorry, I had a cough, so I'll go ahead and edit that out. Anyway, so in LibreOffice, for instance, basically the toolbars here were basically illegible in Linux Mint when I was running a dark theme. Now, to look at it here, it is a little dark, but you can see it. Before, like with Linux Mint, I couldn't even see it at all. So let me just kind of do a quick comparison between the red dark and just the standard Yaru Red. So yeah, that's quite a bit lighter than what I would like, but at the same point, at least the dark theme is still legible and I can actually use it. So that is a bit of a difference, and like I said, it's surprisingly, I felt like they actually did theming very well on this distribution, so I want to definitely give them props for a good implementation at the theming level. One thing that a lot of people talk about when they talk about Ubuntu distributions, and because this is an official flavor of Ubuntu now, they push snap packages very heavily. I am not one of the people that is an anti-snap proponent. And I know there are a lot of people out there on the internet who are definitely anti-snap. I'm fairly neutral either way. I want them, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, then I'll call it out for not working. And one thing I will go ahead and say that the snap programs that I have used on that I've installed on Ubuntu Cinnamon are a little bit hit or miss. For instance, I like to use the Brave web browser, and the Brave web browser with the snap has actually been quite good. It's worked very well for me. I don't know. I've heard comments about people saying how slow it is to start up and whatnot, and I can't say that I've noticed that per se. If it's there, it's not anything that's really bothered me. It's also possible that my computer, being a fairly new CPU and whatnot, that may also be offsetting a lot of the slowness that a lot of people are seeing. So from that perspective, I don't really mind the snap version of Brave. And one thing that I can't really show you right now is, but down here in the bottom right portion of the taskbar, there'll be a little bell that pops up saying, hey, there's an update for Brave. And it's more often than not, it's pretty much Brave is pretty consistently telling me, hey, there's an update for it. And basically all I have to do is close down the browser, and it'll update it, and then I can relaunch it with a new update, and it works really good. And so in that aspect, I haven't found any issues with the snaps as far as that's concerned. And actually, to be fair, a lot of snap-based programs that I've used have been pretty good. I say a lot, but not all of them. For instance, the snap version of RetroArch is horrid. That's the best way I can describe it. It was absolutely just garbage. My control didn't work automatically. It wouldn't even read it. And I started looking online. I was like, oh, you have to install this, you have to install that. And I was just like, dude, I installed these extra packages and it didn't work. And so I was like, I'm not going to sit here and troubleshoot this program that just doesn't work. So basically, instead of the snap version of RetroArch, I installed the Flatpak version. Now, by default, Flatpaks are not enabled in any of the new Ubuntu's, at least in the 2304 versions. Having said that, enabling Flatpak and getting it integrated into the Software Center is actually pretty simple. And it's very easy to do. In fact, let me go ahead and bring up the Software Center real quick. And you can see here, this is the GNOME Software Center. So this, once again, this is another thing that is like, it's really Ubuntu with a different coat of paint, really, because it's a different software center than what you would see in Linux Mint. So let's just go ahead and do a search for something. I know everybody talks about Kden Live all the time, and I tried installing it, and I can never figure out how to use it. That's because I'm not very good at it, whatever. But this one has two sources. You can see there's a Flatpak and a deb source. So getting Flatpak installed is probably a very good idea. And you can see how FlatHub, is integrated into the GNOME Software Center. And I'll put a link to that in the description for this video in case you need to know how to set up Flatpak completely to work on any of the new Ubuntu's. So that's a good one. I'm trying to think, is there another program I can look up? Well, it has GIMP installed by default, which I'm not really sure how I feel about that. But let's see here. Okay, this is a good example. So by default, oddly enough, Ubuntu Cinnamon has the deb package version of GIMP installed. And like I said, this is a default installation. And they didn't go with the snap version. That's actually kind of interesting because you can definitely tell there's a little bit of preference from the community here. Sometimes they'll use the deb package, sometimes they'll use the snap. So I have a feeling if you were to, well, I don't know if Ubuntu installs GIMP by default, but if it did, it probably would have the snap version installed rather than the deb version. But like I said, when you set up Flatpak, you can get the option to do Flatpak, the deb, or the snap version, and you even have the some beta versions that are listed for GIMP in case you were wanting to try those out. So that's a nice little feature here. And honestly, the Software Center, the GNOME Software Center, I don't really have any problem with it, to be honest with you. It's pretty decent. It does it does the job. But then again, I felt that way about pretty much every Software Center really that I've used in Linux. I'm not going to say that one's vastly superior to the other. I guess one thing that a lot of people like to tout is the was it Synaptic package manager, and that one I haven't used that in a very long time, and I can't say I was a big fan of that. But other than that one, I can say that pretty much all the basic Software Centers and pretty much every distribution I've used have been, you know, functional, and they worked really well, and I can't really complain too much about them. One thing I will say about the GNOME Software Center that I've noticed is, and we can test this out right now actually, you can install Flatpak programs via the GNOME Software Center, but sometimes I have noticed there are updates to those Flatpak packages that it doesn't see unless you look at them from the command line. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Hasn't happened too often to me, but I have seen it happen. So definitely something to consider. Other than that, like I said, it's a pretty well put together distribution, a bit of a Frankenstein's monster, if you will, but there is one major thing that I think I would be remiss if I didn't tell you all about this, is I am running with Nvidia graphics drivers. And so let me show you a couple of things that basically kind of bit me pretty hard. And go here to the software and updates. So by default, under here on updates, it says when there are security updates, it had it set to download and install automatically. This is the only distribution that I've been using within the last 2 years or so at this point that I have had stability issues with my Nvidia drivers. Now, part of that may be the fact that this is still a fairly immature distribution, if you will, and I don't mean to say that in a negative connotation, but this is the first time this distribution has been available as an official Ubuntu flavor. And so please don't take that as a negative criticism. That I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing the distribution too much, but one of the things I've noticed, like whenever I Pop! OS, Zorin OS, Linux Mint, whenever there were kernel updates on those distributions, it would automatically reinstall the Nvidia drivers after the fact, and I never had a problem at all with kernel updates on any of those distributions. I've had at least 3 times here that I've had to reinstall my drivers on Ubuntu Cinnamon, and so maybe that's just something they still need to figure out. I haven't used a mainline Ubuntu flavor since, I used Kubuntu, like a couple of years ago, but I don't think that was even Ubuntu 22.04 at that point, so it may have been an older version of Kubuntu. So other than that, I haven't really used a recent version of an Ubuntu flavor, an official Ubuntu flavor, up until now. So I don't know if the other flavors of Ubuntu have this issue, but I can definitely say without a doubt I've run into that on Ubuntu Cinnamon. And the first time I did it, I didn't really know what was going on, so I reinstalled the entire operating system. The second time it happened to me again, and shortly after I reinstalled, basically, I figured out what I needed to do to fix the problem. But at the same time, that's not something that your average user is going to want to do, and some of them may not even be able to do it for people who aren't super tech savvy. So I think that's definitely something that I hope the team for Ubuntu Cinnamon is able to improve upon in the future, because that was just something I didn't see at all in pretty much any of the distributions I've used since I've started using Linux again. So it's definitely something that hopefully it will be addressed in the near future. But it's definitely a thing I want to mention, especially for those people who are using Nvidia drivers. Now, to set up the Nvidia drivers, it's actually very simple. In fact, you see it right there, the additional drivers tab. It has different versions of the driver meta package, as it were. And it says the latest one here is 535 and it's tested. But I guess testing it after a kernel update, maybe not so well tested. But this is the same pretty much additional drivers thing you'll see in pretty much any Ubuntu-based distribution. So it's not really that different. One of the things I did to get around it was just basically get the open source driver working, and then purging all the Nvidia stuff from the system and then reinstalling it after the fact. But that's a pain in the rear end, to say the least. Which is kind of one of the things that I want to wait a little bit before I get a new video card, and that's why I'm still using the old video card. And that does give me a good comparison, actually, because I went from using Linux Mint to using Ubuntu Cinnamon, and really, other than the CPU, the motherboard, all that stuff is completely and totally different. However, the one constant between both those distributions that I used was my video card. So I may have upgraded a lot of different things, but the whole display system is pretty much the same. And so I could definitely tell you from experience that I had a much easier time on other distros compared to this one when it came to doing kernel updates, which is a bit of a shame. And one time I just came in and the computer was just like spinning its fans up one day, and that's because it automatically installed the security updates without even warning me. So I didn't even have a chance to, I had to start fixing it after the fact, and that was like the third time it crashed on me, basically, because of that. And that's because it automatically pushed that update. So I've since changed that setting, actually fairly recently. And I don't know, I mean, even when using the time shift backup utility, that's only just so useful, because it'll go back to a previous snapshot, but then when it pushes those kernel updates again, you're still going to have to deal with the issue. And one things I'm thinking of doing for my computer in the future is I want to get an AMD video card to go along with it, one of the newer generation AMD video cards, which also has some good video encoding to be somewhat equal to the NVENC encoder that the Nvidia video cards have. And so I'm kind of waiting, because I don't want to get the super high-end one, because that's just kind of out of my price range. And I'm not really sure I want the entry-level one they have right now, so I'm kind of waiting for that middle range lineup of video cards to become available. And from that perspective, if you're running with an AMD or an Intel video card, these issues may be completely and totally, moot for you, because basically your drivers are built into the kernel. And if that's the case, if you're running, newer AMD hardware to include the video card, then probably Ubuntu Cinnamon may be one of the better options for you to consider. The reason why I'm not super glowing on Ubuntu Cinnamon is there's a lot of people out there, myself included, who are still using Nvidia video cards. And from that perspective, that is an issue with this distribution that I haven't experienced with other ones, unfortunately. So there's a bit of a mixed bag there. As far as all the other gaming stuff I've done, with the exception of that RetroArch snafu with the snap package, Steam has worked great, obviously. I've used Bottles to run GOG Galaxy client, and I've actually had some pretty good luck with that, as you've seen from that you may have seen from some of my recent playthroughs. So that's worked really well. I haven't yet tried to install some other emulators like Citra. I'll probably try to do that here eventually. But for the most part, from a gaming perspective, I've had really good luck with the system, except for when it would mess up my video drivers. So other than that, as a daily driver, as a gaming platform, I actually think Ubuntu Cinnamon is a good option. Personally, I felt I liked the feel of Linux Mint a little better. Some of the stuff they had, not so much the desktop environment, because the desktop environment is still pretty much almost the same, but there are some substantial differences with choices of programs that were installed, and just a little, it just feels a little more like I said, a hodgepodge. Not necessarily a bad thing, but keeps everything here in the administration center. Oh, look at that, Synaptic Package Manager. I don't remember installing that. So it may have installed perhaps a lot of extra things that you may or may not need. Personally, I don't have anything against GIMP, but I don't think I really need it either. So that being installed by default was kind of, whatever. So I wouldn't call it super bloated. I've seen more bloated distributions, but it definitely has a little bit of a bloat factor to it. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Other than that, though, I would say that Ubuntu Cinnamon it's a good operating system, but if you're running Nvidia hardware, you may basically be a little trepidatious about it, because you may end up running into some stability issues, because I definitely did, for sure, at least 3 times. And I made a bookmark of the actual troubleshooting steps to kind of get around that. And I'll go ahead and I'll put that in the description for this video as well, because if you do have issues with your video card, there are steps that you can do to get around it. It's not the end of the world, but it will basically require you to do some troubleshooting, possibly depending on how bad it is, from a command line, by doing like Control-Alt F1 or F2 to go into an alternative terminal after you reboot your system. I had to do that as well. So if you're comfortable with doing that, then I can recommend Ubuntu Cinnamon for those who have some fairly new hardware on their system, and you need the newer kernel, and you want to stick with the Ubuntu ecosphere, as it were, then basically I think it's a good option. Personally, I felt that Linux Mint just felt better put together, and I liked it more. So I would definitely rank Linux Mint above this one. But for me, I'll go ahead and say it's still a maturing operating system. I'm sure they're going to try to work out the bugs, but at this point in time, I'd probably have to give it about an 80%. It's definitely not all the way there. They need to fix those Nvidia issues drastically. It's a serious issue. But other than that, the system has been fairly stable and good for me. Snap packages, hit or miss. I haven't soured on using snaps from using this. For the most part, a lot of the snaps I used worked really well, with that exception of RetroArch. So I can't really say they're horrible, but when they are bad, they're really bad. So keep that in mind. But like I said, it's easy to work around and get Flatpak installed. In fact, there's still a lot of packages that are only on Flatpak. So getting Flatpak set up It's very easy, and with all the Flatpak, Snap, and Deb, you should be able to get pretty much every software thing that you need available at the click of a button. And the Software Center is pretty decent to work with. No problems. It works really well. So other than that, that's my thoughts on using Ubuntu Cinnamon for the last 3.5 months roughly. And I can recommend it, but not recommend it highly. So recommended. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.